Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build beautiful online presence. Hello friends, I hope that you've been well. In today's video, we are going to be continuing on my Zodiac portrait series. If you haven't been with my channel, this is something I have been working on once a month, and today's video will be Gemini. And the topic of the video will be kind of me sharing my tips and advice on what brushes to pick. If you didn't already know, I actually collaborated with Craftimo to create my own custom paintbrush set. And so being given the opportunity to make the perfect paintbrush set for myself, I knew I wanted the brushes to be very versatile since I myself work in a lot of different mediums such as watercolors, gouache, and inks. So I wanted a set that was going to work for everything that I use. And I'm not going to beat around the bush. These are the shapes and sizes that come in this set. So first, I knew I needed to have a wide flat brush. This is something that's going to get a lot of coverage. Then we have two filberts, one in an 8 and one in a 6. These ones are flat but have a rounded edge. I find these are great for acrylic gouache. Then of course we have 3 different rounds, which is the most versatile brush, and we have these in 3 different sizes. This last one is a 3/0, which is great for line art and super fine details. But before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. As you probably know by now, Squarespace is a great website building platform that is perfect for a variety of creatives. Personally, as someone who creates illustrations as well as YouTube videos, a very useful feature that I have come across is that I can attach a link to the corresponding illustration on my gallery, which allows me to feature 2 pieces of content at once. This is especially helpful if anyone is curious about the materials or the process of a particular illustration. It can take them directly to the video, which is so quick and efficient. So if you're interested in launching your own website, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And jumping straight into the illustration, I'm going to be showing you the process, but also talking about the influences of creating the Gemini illustration, as well as describing the functions of each of these brushes and why I chose these particular shapes and sizes. So first we have, of course, the wide flat brush. This here I'm using to use just water to cover the page first so that it's going to be allowing the paint to just sort of glide around the paper a little easier. This is a wet on wet technique. And then being a little bit more targeted on the hair area, I'm using the round, and then using the round shape to, again, go in for a little bit more targeted areas, this time going in for the blush. And while the paint and the paper is still wet, that's why the colors just sort of like seamlessly kind of bleed with each other. And yeah, this big wide brush is so handy, not only for just making the surface of the paper wet, but also, of course, getting a lot of coverage in these kind of wider areas like I'm doing for the sky on the background here. But what's great about this kind of sharp edge is you can see here I can use the corners and the edges to be a little bit more precise in where I'm placing the paint. You can see I'm just sort of like getting into the little corners of where the edges of the clouds are going to be on the top. And yeah, I find that especially with a limited kind of size range for your brush set, it's really handy to have one of those big ones just to speed up the process. And it just, like I mentioned earlier, gets a lot more coverage and is a lot more efficient in its coverage area, but also the amount of paint it can hold. And then when it came to the round brushes, these are probably the most versatile shape in my opinion when it comes to the type of style of painting that I do, because not only can it get into kind of smaller detailed areas because of its sharp point, but depending on how much pressure you apply on the paintbrush, you can get a wide variety of sizes with it as well. And when I was selecting the length of the paintbrush, initially I had requested a bristle that was a little bit longer because in my mind I thought, oh, if the brush is longer, it will be able to hold more paint, and then that means I don't have to dip into my, paint as often. But what I ended up finding when I was using the first sample was that yes, it did hold more paint, but because the bristle was longer, I found it actually a lot more difficult to control because it has that flexibility to it. And for me, I didn't want a bristle that was going to be stiffer because I really like having that flexibility. You can see here as I'm working on the hair there, it really is so beneficial to have that little bit of pressure, be able to flex to the shape of those kind of detailed little wisps on the ends of the hair strands. So I knew that with the bristle type, I wanted to make sure that it still had a little bit of bounce, but wasn't too soft that it wouldn't be able to handle a heavier weight paint. So I ended up asking for a slightly shorter bristle for the second round of samples, and I found that was a lot easier to control. And that's really important for me because of the type of work that I make. It's a little bit cleaner and requires precision. So that's just something to keep in mind when you are out looking for paintbrushes and you are trying to decide what shapes and lengths to buy. A longer bristle will mean a lot of flexibility and will hold more paint, but in turn, you're trading it for less control. It really just depends on the type of painter you are and what you're looking for. You can see the way that I hold my paintbrushes too. I hold it pretty close to the base, again, because I want more control. But if you're somebody who is looking for something a little bit looser in your style, or you don't necessarily need exact precision, but you would like the efficiency of a longer bristle to be able to hold more paint, that's something to keep in mind. And when it came to the bristle type, so the actual brush hairs, like I mentioned, I wanted my paintbrushes to be very versatile depending on the mediums. And so when it comes to watercolors, which is what I'm using for the first portion of this process here, typically watercolor brushes that are meant for just watercolors, the bristles are very, very soft because you want to hold a lot of water, you want to hold a lot of paint and be able to get a lot of coverage. But because I wanted these brushes to work with watercolors and gouache being a much heavier medium, I needed to go for a bristle that was a little bit stiffer, a little bit stronger, so that it can handle the weight of a heavier paint like gouache. But I didn't want to go for a hog's hair, which is very scratchy and very, very strong, which is typically made for heavy body acrylics or oil paints, because I still want that little bit of bounce and flexibility with the watered down mediums, whether it be watercolors, inks, or a watered down gouache. So synthetic paintbrushes is typically what I'm looking for when it comes to bristles, because they are sturdy but still have some they're still a little bit soft and flexible. They're, like Goldilocks. It's that perfect kind of balance, the in-between. But again, this is specific to the custom paintbrushes that I made and also the type of paintbrushes that I personally prefer. It really is something that you have to evaluate on the types of mediums that you use and what you're looking for in your paintbrushes in order to achieve the type of artwork that you want to make. Because if you're somebody who paints with really heavy, thick paints like acrylics or oils, and you're using them in a way where you create a lot of texture or you use big globs of paint, that means you're going to need a paintbrush that's going to be a lot sturdier, because the weight of the paint will affect how it holds on the paintbrush. And if you're somebody who primarily paints with watercolors or just really thin, watered down mediums, in that case, you might want to go for a watercolor paintbrush that specifically is for watercolors, because again, those natural bristles or paintbrushes that are specific to watercolors, they absorb so much more water, and that means they just hold so much more, and they create these really soft, airy looks, which is perfect for those types of mediums and that type of look if that's what you're going for. But for me, I need precision, I need that control, and so I go for something that is a synthetic but on the kind of softer end. Plus, the great thing about synthetic paintbrushes is they are definitely more durable, I believe. I'm somebody who is not the best at taking care of my paintbrushes. I would say that I'm not the worst either, though. For me, I make sure to clean the paint off of the paintbrush with water so that the paint, especially acrylic wash, isn't drying onto the bristles. But I don't really use paintbrush soap or really soap much when it comes to actually like thoroughly cleaning my paintbrushes. But that's something that is worth keeping in mind as well. And when I'm like rinsing the paintbrushes of paint in the water, I'm like kind of rough with it, I would say, when I'm just like kind of pushing it around. And I find that with synthetic paintbrushes, I don't have to feel nearly as precious with them either in terms of how I use them. Not that I'm a super rough painter necessarily, but again, something to keep in mind when you are searching for the paintbrushes for yourself. And of course, this is probably a given, but the sizes and variety of paintbrushes also depends on the type of work that you make. The selection of paintbrushes that I chose for my custom set here do range on the smaller side because I don't paint that big and I do paint a lot of more kind of detailed things. And again, it's all about that precision and that control that I want out of my process. But if you're somebody who paints a lot looser, if you paint a lot bigger, some of these smaller paintbrushes would be like totally useless to you. And many people do purchase specific types of paintbrushes for all the different mediums that they use, and that's perfectly fine. And I actually used to do that. I used to have paintbrushes that I would use generally for my watercolors, and I'd have paintbrushes that I would use for my gouache. But now I'm in a place in my kind of artistic journey where I use multiple mediums within one illustration. And for me, it just seems so much more seamless to be able to use the same brushes back and forth depending on whichever medium, because I use them quite interchangeably. Like, for example, when I was painting those clouds, the purple is watercolors, and then those blues or like the turquoises are acrylic wash. And so I was using the same brushes back and forth and using both different mediums and blending them with each other. So it's just much more efficient to be able to use the same brushes within one session. And when it comes to why I chose the shapes that I chose, obviously the large kind of flat brush seems self-explanatory in terms of getting big, large coverage. And then these rounds, as I've been displaying and describing, they're extremely versatile. But a shape that maybe some people might not typically think of is the filberts, so the ones that are flat but have that rounded kind of top. So you can see in the process here, I'm kind of laying down that bright blue eyeshadow with the round, but then I'm using a filbert to kind of blend out the edges. And this, for me, is one of the reasons why I like using a filbert throughout my process. But another thing with filberts is because it has that flat shape, I find that it just has a much more even coverage. So blending makes it a lot kind of smoother and more natural, I guess. And when it comes to when I'm actually using it for coverage with acrylic paints, or acrylic wash, I should say, I find it's a lot flatter and much more even, because when it comes to the rounds, sometimes it kind of digs into the paint because of its like pointed shape. And that's definitely not what I want when I want the coverage to be very even and not have any brush strokes. So I find that with the filberts, it eliminates that brushstroke look. And that's really important when it comes to certain areas in my painting, especially with acrylic wash. And yeah, to actually talk about the illustration itself, so when it came to Gemini, their symbol is the twins. And the typical motif, of course, is to draw a pair of twins or two figures, two people, two characters together. And me kind of just going with the flow, that was what I originally thought I was going to do. I was originally thinking I was going to do like a yin and yang type scenario like I did with my previous interpretation of Gemini, but I had a couple of people express that they found that motif kind of tired and just overdone, and expressing how Geminis should still be seen as a singular person because that is the case. Like Gemini, it is one person. So in order to still give that duality, I decided to go with a mirror motif where we are seeing the reflection of the person. And that to me is still signaling, yes, like this is one singular person, but we are reflecting, you know, the duality, like the twins element of this sign without actually having two different characters. And with the actual like kind of fashion and design choices for this character, I purposely wanted to go with something that felt a little bit more androgynous, which is why this hairstyle, the kind of suit and tie, but paired with this really dramatic makeup, it sort of plays into that duality aspect. So we're seeing a character that has both traditionally masculine and feminine choices, like the tie being the masculine and the makeup being feminine. And when I choose the kind of elements when it comes to these zodiac portraits, I do actually look up to see what celebrities or famous people are part of these signs and sort of look to them as somewhat inspiration. And I thought it was really interesting to see Troye Sivan, June from 17, Hoshi from 17, and Yosang from 80s, as well as Prince, all being Geminis. And to me, I thought that was so fascinating because I feel like they all have a similar aura in a way. Obviously, they're all their own people and they're different, but there is a sense of charisma and flamboyancy to a lot of their fashion. And so the curly hair was definitely a nod to Prince and Troye Sivan. And the makeup, especially this eyeshadow look, was heavily inspired by June, Hoshi, and the rest of the performance team from 17 in their recent Spell music video. And K-pop in general, I feel like the male idols do play a lot into some traditionally kind of feminine styling choices when it comes to fashion, and I absolutely love that. So again, really taking a lot of inspiration from just playing with gender norms and things that are traditionally feminine and masculine and just sort of like pairing them up together. Troye Sivan actually in a more recent music video dressed up in drag and looked phenomenal, like absolutely stunning. And of course, Prince was very well known for really being very loud and bold and experimental with his fashion choices as well. So I feel like I hopefully captured kind of a lot of these different people like style and essence into this Gemini portrait. And then when it came to other Gemini motifs, the color palette that I had read about was actually light green and yellow, but I really have a hard time using yellow as a prominent color in color palettes. And I knew that one of the flowers that I wanted to include that was attached to Gemini is lavender. So I decided to lean into the lavender flowers for the background here, as well as lavender and purple as a color combo with the light green. And then for the pattern on the vest, I went with another flower that's associated with Gemini, which is Lily of the Valley. And I just really had a lot of fun playing with the different patterns on the outfit, since a lot of my other characters for this series has been adorned with a lot of accessories or a lot of different elements in their clothing to kind of give it a lot of visual interest. But since when it comes to like a suit and tie, that's very like flat real estate. So I feel like adding in the patterns just gives it a little bit more visual interest into something that, you know, doesn't have a lot of other elements to it, such as texture or folds in fabric, you know, draping or shine, you know, something that just needs to give it a little bit of oomph. So that's why I decided to go with the 3 different kind of clashing patterns. Of course, we as people are very nuanced and diverse, so I don't expect that my zodiac interpretations are going to be able to accurately represent every Gemini out there. But regardless, I hope that you enjoy this take and appreciate something that might be a slightly different motif from a typical twins illustration for Gemini. And with that being said, we are pretty much wrapping up here on the process. I hope that you enjoyed watching it. And by the way, if you are interested in my custom paintbrushes that I collabed with Craftimo at the time of this recording, they currently are on sale and there are still a few left. So hit the link in the description if you are interested in picking up your own set. They are limited edition, so I cannot guarantee that they will come back after they sell out. And as always, if you are interested in this Gemini artwork, if you sign up to my Patreon page before the end of the month, so June 30th, you will receive the print or print and matching sticker if you sign up to the Sapphire or Emerald tier. And you'll also get access to my entire Patreon with exclusive videos, podcasts, behind the scenes, sketches, and preliminary stuff. And if that's not something that interests you, my online shop is open as well. So either way, I appreciate any and all support that you give me. And I hope that you have an amazing day or evening wherever you're at. And I will catch you in the next one. Bye.